We were asked to tackle the question, what will it take to effectively tackle the polycrisis? It's a nicely worded question. If the question had been worded, what will it take to effectively solve the polycrisis, I would have been able to answer you in a very straightforward way that it's a stupid question and that nothing will. But tackling, we can do something about that. So I'll get to what the tackling might amount to. It still might be a bit less than some of you are hoping for in terms of something less than solving and more than merely somehow muddling along. And the reason why I may be disappointing to some of you in terms of what I'm able to offer this afternoon is I think we have to face very squarely the direness of our predicament now. I wrote a book, my most recent single-authored book, which I was delighted to find on Mike's shelf in his office this afternoon. It's called Do You Want to Know the Truth? The Surprising Rewards of Climate Honesty. And the idea of that book is that it is essential at this moment in history for us to face our predicament squarely. If we don't, the things we do in response to it will definitely fail to rise to the scale of the occasion. So let me briefly mention a couple of ways in which our predicament has worsened considerably over the last few years. So in preparation for this event, I went back and looked at Mike's book, There Is No Planet B, and there is this wonderful passage in the early part of it where he's talking about what can we aim for. And it goes like this. This is the future he is hoping for us to be able to arrive at. The air is fresher. Life is healthier, longer, more relaxed, more fun and more exciting. Our diets are varied, tasty and healthy. More of us get out as much as we want to, both socially and physically. Travel is easier, and it goes on like this. And I'm afraid one of the things I want to put to Mike, and it's a genuine question, is does he still think that that vision is available? Because my judgment is that maybe it was available when he wrote that book and published it 5 years ago, but that it isn't now. Right, so let me just mention a couple of things that have occurred, as I say, in the last couple of years. So one, as you will be, I'm sure, well aware, is the deterioration of our climatic situation. But most people, I suspect, even most people in the room are not aware of just how drastic that deterioration is. There's been a jump in temperatures over the last couple of years, and it doesn't seem to be going back down very much. People talk about staying below the 1.5 degree maximum limit of safe global overheat. That is now a completely old-fashioned discussion. Anyone who is serious in this space knows that that is long gone. A more interesting visceral measure of where we're at in terms of climate is the measure in terms of the Earth's energy imbalance. So that's the difference between the amount of energy that's going back out to space and the amount of energy that's staying in, right? So how much the heat is building up in our atmosphere as these temperatures increase. And it's gone from, there's been a sudden leap in the last couple of years, but it's been on a gradual upward trend line for quite a long time now. 20 years ago, it was at the already rather alarming rate of 3 Hiroshimas per second in terms of heat being added to the atmosphere. It's now at around 12 Hiroshimas per second. Now, that's a quadrupling in 20 years of the amount of additional heat that's being trapped. People sometimes think the climate crisis, one of the troubles with it is that it's kind of too gradual for us to respond, but actually that isn't really that gradual. A quadrupling of the actual imbalance of heat building up in our atmosphere in just 20 years. And this basically is why you're seeing this indescribable level of hurricanes and floods and so on. So there's more energy in the atmosphere, there's more energy in the water. Of course it's going to come out in these ways. And I don't know about you, but I frankly have been quite shaken by what's happened in the last few months. Even I didn't expect something quite as atrocious as that quite as soon as this. The other thing I want to mention, which has also happened in just the last couple of years, and again, you'll all be familiar with this, but again, I think people don't always realise quite how drastic the implications are, is the AI situation. And of course, yes, I know AI is going to have all sorts of positive consequences. For example, I have a friend who tells me reliably that it's going to make some climate litigation easier because you can go through immense documents of company accounts, etc., in no time at all and figure out where they're cheating and all that kind of stuff. Brilliant. But my judgment is, and I'm not alone, some of the creators of AI have this same judgment. My judgment is that we are at severe risk on a number of levels of being blindsided and frankly devastated by AI. One risk which people are aware of is the way that it's adding to the climate problem, and this is partly how the Polycrisis works. It's an overlapping set of threats that often mutually reinforce by direct emissions. But that is actually, I think, only a small part of the trouble that AI is getting us into. More significant than that probably is the knock-on effect that AI is having in terms of optimizing economic processes, enabling us to mine more efficiently, to find fossil fuels more efficiently. Now, of course, in a rational world, it would be possible to respond to that by saying, then we can have less mines, and we can have less oil wells. What are the chances in the world as it actually is of that being the response? I predict to you that they're very low. And then there's other entire dimensions of the AI acceleration, such as the alarming ease now in producing deep fakes, which I think is very soon going to seriously disable media and politics in ways that we have seen glimpses of in things like Cambridge Analytica, but we're going to a whole nother level now. We're absolutely not ready for it. So the situation is, to put it in plain terms, catastrophic, and I think we have to pay attention to that. What are our prognoses? In my view, there is a small but rapidly closing window for us to avoid civilizational collapse. Not for us to stay below 1.5 degrees. It's all gone. Forget about that. For us to avoid civilizational collapse. And that is the reason why my new book, which is out in a few weeks' time, sadly, the rush copy did not get here in time for me to show it to you today, is called Transformative Adaptation. We'll come back to that point in a minute. And the subtitle is what interests me here. The subtitle is, Another World is Still Just Possible. And that is what I believe, and that is what I am still striving for, along, I'm sure, with many of you. But I think it is still just possible. And we should not fool ourselves into thinking that we've got a long time to make course corrections. The trajectory we're heading, in my view, straight towards collapse, straight towards dystopia. The option of having some kind of utopia, I'm sorry to have to say the passage I read out from Mike earlier strikes me now as utopian in the context we are now in. What I call for is a throughtopian path through the middle. And throughutopia is, how do we get through what is coming at us, the unprecedented, terrifying, overlapping set of crises that are coming at us in the best way possible. And I have one initial suggestion on how we do that, and that is by taking adaptation absolutely seriously. That is by getting absolutely serious about deep adaptation, which means adaptation to potential societal collapse. It means getting absolutely serious about transformative and strategic adaptation, which is the main kind of adaptation I think we should be engaged in, which means adaptation that simultaneously mitigates and that works with nature rather than against nature, and that tries to co-create the kind of society we actually need and want. And that kind of adaptation is what my new book is about. It's also about what the new campaign that will be emerging from the Climate Majority Project is all about. Strategic adaptation for emergency resilience. SAFER for short, you heard it here first. That's what we can become, safer. We cannot become safe. We can become safer relative to these threats. And that's how we can tackle the polycrisis. Some of you might think that isn't really tackling it. But what I'm talking about is coping with the crisis in the best way possible so we can get through it in the best way possible and make our lives as good as they now possibly can be. And here's the exciting bit. Here's the good bit. If you were waiting for the good news, here it is. My passionate belief is that if and as and when we get serious about adaptation, the right kind of adaptation, and stop putting all our eggs in the basket of prevention and mitigation, because that ship has sailed. If and as and when we get serious about adaptation, it will be the mother of all embodied wake-up calls. When people hear about, we ought to do something about this colourless, odorless gas that is going to get us into trouble by 2035 or 2050, most of them still have very little idea what you're talking about. When people see you engaging in adaptation or take part in it themselves, in resilience building, in water storage, in restoring wetlands and so on and so forth, then they get it. Oh, we're actually in trouble. We have to be doing these things now to take care of ourselves. And so my great hope is that as that embodied wake-up call starts to rise and take shape, it will rocket fuel everything else, including, for example, climate mitigation, including endeavours to get serious on AI and the other existential threats facing us. That, I think, is our best shot at effectively tackling the polycrisis. It may not be what you wanted to hear, but it's the best you're going to get, so I advise going for it. Thank you.
Well, I will in a minute follow on with a few other words, possibly in parallel to some of that. But what do you think? Should we just check the mood of the room and just
straw poll?
Let's do a little bit. So if we just ask you to, in a moment, to put up your hands in one of 3 or 4 ways. Number one, if you think that in broad terms the situation is about as serious as Rupert's laid out, we're going to ask you to put up your hand. Then we're going to say, if you think he's fundamentally exaggerated, never mind the details, but if you think he's fundamentally exaggerated, to put up your hand. If you think he's fundamentally underestimated, to put up your hand. And lastly, we'll just do a check for if you just don't like putting up your hand. So if you think in broad terms he's fundamentally got it about right, can you put up your hand now? So good look around. A lot of hands in the air. If you think he has fundamentally exaggerated it, put up your hand. Have a good look around. If you think he has fundamentally underestimated the seriousness of the situation we're in, right up, there's a few hands going up in the air. And if you just didn't want to put up your hand for any of those votes,
put up your hand.
Right.
Helpful.
Interesting. So that helps us with the mood of the room. So, what would I say? I know you'll be with me if I say I'm broadly with Rupert. Just to emphasise a few things, he's right. We absolutely need to stare this in the face. I think there's a kind of bogus narrative going round that somehow it helps us to respond to this if we don't quite say it like it is, and if we just don't really lay out the facts properly. I think that's really, really unhelpful. It leads to things like techno-optimism, people saying, well, a bit of technology will get us through this. I think that's almost the thing that makes me most depressed about all this. Second thing to emphasise is that we talk about climate a lot, but actually it really is just one symptom of something much, much bigger that's going on for humanity. There's obviously got climate and biodiversity and food and pollution and all these things interconnecting. But the really big thing that's going on is that we're suddenly such a hugely powerful species on what used to be a big, robust planet that could put itself back together again, whatever we did to it. And then it was a planet that we could still pretend, we could still get away with acting as if it could put itself back together again, even if it wasn't quite. And now it's just really, really not putting itself back together again. And that's a totally fundamentally different context for humans to be operating in from the one in which we worked out how to do economics and how to do politics and how to think and how to run society, how to think about life, all of that stuff. So we need a complete re-engineering of how we do life if we're going to get through the next decades. And it's a really deep challenge to everything. So this business, how are we going to thrive in the Anthropocene? And then the other thing I think I'd want to just really nail is when you hear even really well-intentioned people like John Kerry, I heard him on the radio the other day saying we're making progress, we're just not making fast enough progress, and Antonio Guterres from the UN saying we're not making progress fast enough. That's not what's happening. The reality is we are not making progress, right? The hard fact of this in terms of climate is that if you look at the rate of emissions, it's pretty well a straight rising line with some dents in it for things like COVID and whatever. And there is no statistically valid evidence from that curve that humans have even noticed climate change, right? It's just the action we're taking just isn't anything, right? Where you can maybe argue the case that curve used to be exponential, and I wrote about this a few years ago, and now you can argue the case that it looks more, the last 50 years look more like a linear line. And if that's good news for you, then okay, maybe that's the best we can get. So that doesn't mean we can't get on top of this, or we couldn't take that curve down, but it does mean we have to radically change the game. And it's not about trying to do more of the same, trying to gear up more of the same kind of actions. It's about thinking completely differently about the whole thing. And there's a ton of bogus narrative going around about this. So, more renewables don't help us on their own. Actually, they're just adding to our energy supply. We're having more renewables alongside more fossil fuels. So the whole basic thinking about the dynamics is just not letting us tackle the problems in terms that will allow us to. And I think where I'm getting to in terms of, I've just also written a book. It's going to be a little bit later than Rupert's coming out. It's just being proofread now. But where I'm getting to is that, so if we're going to rethink on what would it take for us to be starting to take actions that are sensible on all of this, then we need to look at the history of failure so far. 29 COPs, my goodness, 3 decades of crystal clear science, and that curve just keeps going up and up, and the height of that curve represents the speed at which we make things worse by a larger amount every year. And we have to stand further back from the problem and ask what's going on. We have to dig deeper under the surface of it all and ask what are the reasons behind the reasons why we're not getting anywhere. And we need to join all the issues up better and so on. And just think differently about reframe the whole problem. And I think when you do that, what you come to is that the critical levers aren't the ones that we talk about, right? So they're definitely not things like technology. I think they're probably really simple things, simple principles, but very difficult to, much harder to enact. And I would put it down to maybe a couple of things. So one is just straightforward honesty. If I look, for example, just to bring it to a smaller scale for a minute, if I look at the worst climate decisions that have been made around the UK recently, things like the coal mine. By the way, we've got Maggie in the room who probably single-handedly already, and Henry and others who have actually nailed that thing. But if you look at all the bad decisions that were around on that, they weren't just errors of judgment, they were fundamentally, deeply dishonest at their heart. And we allow that stuff, and we tolerate a level of routine dishonesty at the national level, at the global level, which actually I don't think humans can get through the next few decades in any kind of shape if we can't raise the bar on that. But I think the good news is that I think it feels like there are things we can do to change that, or at least it's not proven that we can't. So for me, that's a really high leverage area. And the second one, which I don't write about so much, just because I don't sort of feel as I've got the credentials to really, but if there's anybody, I don't know, there must be some people who do, but is that we are 8 billion people on this planet right now, and we will sink or swim together. Or we think about it, however individualistically we might need to think, we are one tribe now, and we have got to learn to operate as one tribe, because that's how it just has to be. So whether you are Palestinian or Israeli or Ukrainian or Russian or American or European or British or whatever, we have to treat every life as a fundamentally equal value, and we have to rework global society that it's doing, which feels like an incredibly difficult challenge. But I think it doesn't matter how difficult you think that is. I think it's must-have. I don't see how there's a way through this, doing that. So there we go. The challenge is a massive evolution of the whole way that operate on this planet in response to the fact that we are now so powerful that we need a wisdom and a compassion and an honesty to go with that. That would be my starter.
Yeah, like maybe the first thing I'd like to pick up is kind of you ended there with, you used the phrase critical levers, and this is a big concern of ours in the Climate Majority Project, and I hope this is something we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about here afternoon. You mentioned truthfulness as one of those. Very strongly agree with that. Truthfulness and authenticity. Obviously, that was implicit already in what I said and what I sought to bring. The way we see it, the power of that lever was shown very dramatically in 2019 by what we did. Extinction Rebellion and the school climate strikes, and also David Attenborough's Climate Change, the Facts. That was a tremendous precedent. In fact, it's the best thing for many of us that's happened basically in our entire lives. The most hopeful moments in politics at large, never mind in environmental action. What we're seeking to do in the Climate Majority Project is, if you will, to extend and democratise that lever. If it's really to move mountains or move the earth in a, Archimedean kind of way, need to be available to us in our millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions to people who will never want to join the radical flank of the climate movement, etc. I think that's one that kind of runs through it. Another lever, obviously, as we see it and I see it, is adaptation in the way I described. Another lever which we might talk about is the business world. So the business world obviously now has immense power. What's happened in the business world for quite a long time is that people have sought to channel a little bit of that power into CSR and ESG, and this has now, I think, been revealed to be a fundamentally inefficacious strategy that's now plain to see. You can see that in the story of, what are they called? The supposedly kind of ethical, they produce soap and Unilever. Unilever is now sort of halfway to where they started, and they're still pointed in the wrong direction. To sort of try to go in this direction by themselves have been fired in various companies. In insurance, you had the Net Zero Insurance Alliance that was destroyed by political resistance. This way of trying to do business green, i.e. doing it voluntarily and doing it through encouraging ethical consumerism and business action sort of on the side, sustainability, I think we now know basically doesn't work. So what could work? So our argument in the Climate Majority Project is that what you have to do is you have to get businesses themselves to admit that they don't have the power, acting individually, to get anywhere even remotely close to where we need to be, and for them to put their main endeavour into lobbying seriously for a higher level playing field for everybody to drive out factors. Our campaign is called Regulate Us, or Regulate Us Better. An enormous ask, but it seems to us the only kind of ask that might actually get anywhere near where we need to get. Two more levers. One, will be obvious to everybody, is the media, because right now the media is largely a kind of blocker, and it actually needs to be an enabler. I don't think there's any way we get anywhere close to civilisational collapse without media, which is actually helping us move in the right direction rather than going in the wrong direction. That's incredibly difficult to imagine, that transformation. I think one way we might be able to imagine it is by imagining how we might be able to transform social media, partly through people getting more and more fed up with the absolute destructiveness and untruthfulness of existing social media and divisiveness of it. I think another way we might be able to imagine it is that actually I think that if we've got some serious green philanthropists years to come, I suspect there will be a few more of those emerging as more of those folk realise how absolutely deadly the situation is. I think a really good thing for them to do would be sort of anti-Musks, and to try to create media and social media and every kind of media which is actually really good, which is actually really truthful, which is actually deeply concerned about ecology, etc., which is depolarising rather than repolarising. And then finally, kind of that, I think that the role of the arts, so-called entertainment, is absolutely crucial. I'm advocating a lot for a book called The Deluge by Steve Markley, which is, I think, the closest we have so far to a through-topia, a picture of how we might get through what is coming. If you read this book, then for about the first 800 pages, you might think, why the hell did Rupert Read recommend this book? Okay, brilliantly written, but the first 800 pages is a kind of litany of disasters and there's a few spoilers here, minor spoilers, litany of disasters and kind of efforts and so forth in this sort of alternative version of our world that he imagines. But there is some kind of turning of the path as you get towards the final part of the book. It's absolutely amazing. The Deluge by Steve Markley. We need much more of that kind of thing. We need it mass media. We need it film. People need to be able to imagine and see themselves in a future which isn't just dystopian or utopian for the reasons I gave earlier. It seems to me that if we manage to really get somewhere on all of those points of leverage, well, then we have a chance of really getting somewhere. It's an enormous ask, but that's the kind of thing it would actually take, it seems to me, to adequately tackle the polycrisis. As I say, by tackle, I do not mean anything like solve. I mean in such a way that we don't collapse, that such that everything doesn't get swept away.
So I think, in terms of how bad does it have to be, I think we need to respond to that. So
how bad does it have to get before people get to the place where enough of them are ready to step up?
Right. Yeah. So bad is it inevitably going to be? I don't think we know. I don't think the science is clear on how fast things are going to fall apart, when cascading tipping points might kick in. There was a paper in Bioscience a couple of weeks ago from top climate scientists, Lenton, Michael Mann, Rostrom. So, the way that they wrote that kind of the planet piece is as close to screaming as I think I've ever seen in kind of scientific literature. So we don't know exactly where that point is, and whether if we take the action that we're so far away from being anywhere near taking at the moment, You don't know whether we get away with it, whether if we even left it another decade, would we get away with it? Feels unlikely. I don't know, whatever. But we don't know that. And we also don't know about the resilience of global society. We can see how easily wars break out. We can imagine how easily a whole lot could come tumbling down. But we don't really know, if push comes to shove, how resilient that is. That's a great unknown. So the odds are somewhere between, if you have some line in the sand of, well, what does a catastrophe look like? What are the odds of that happening? It's somewhere between 0% and 100%. And actually, it's all you need to know in order to get a feel, just to get off that butt. Just in terms of the kind, read out a few words from my book, in terms of what I think about that, I agree with you. I think the window is really closed over the last 5 years. I think the science has got worse, and I think global society has absolutely continued to sit on its butt. And I think the standard of the debate has gone down. The standards of honesty have gone down. The BBC's got worse in our own country. Kind of politics we've had has been desperate. So I do think the window is closed since I wrote that book. But in terms of what do I think about, I still think it's the case that the more we take the right kinds of actions, the closer we get to that kind of world. I actually think that we can take right now do enable those sorts of things to become more true. And however desperate things get, the more we take the right kinds of actions, further we'll be on a spectrum between life is totally awful and life is wonderful and quality of life is higher than it's ever been. I still think it's more action we take, the more we move those variables. I also agree with you about AI. I think one of the things I talked about, this whole re-engineering of the way we do life. One of the things that we need to do is we need a new relationship with technology, because some technologies will really help us. But it's not good enough to say this technology has good applications. You need to also be able to say this technology won't be used for bad applications. And the whole dynamics of growth and so on mean that efficiency improvements tend to make things worse at the moment, which is such a simple piece of modelling that every policymaker should have their head round. And yet we don't talk about it. So you could ask the question, why not? It's not conceptually too difficult to understand that. But specifically, we need to get much better at choosing which technologies we press the button on and making sure that we have them only used for good applications. And that is really challenging on AI, because if you were going to ask if there's anything about the trajectory of AI at the moment, which is driven by market forces, powered along by some very big businesses and a lot of money, if there's anything about that trajectory that you felt wasn't good for people and planet, how on earth would you go about making an intervention to change it in some way? And advice to anyone trying to set up the process by which that might be possible would be to say, well, learn from the climate cops. Because you have to learn from the failure of the climate cops, because you absolutely haven't got 30 years to stand around letting things get worse and worse, right? And those climate cops have been pretty well 100% ineffectual. We could talk about whether or not they've made some difference or not, but I think it's a bit of a long debate, but I think you could argue the case they haven't done anything. I wanted to come back a little bit about the business stuff.
Oh, yeah.
We work a lot with businesses. Here we are at Small World working primarily with businesses. And I think it's always a really hard question to ask. How do you know when you're part of the problem? How do you know when you're just colluding in part of the problem? And I think we can definitely probably look back on some clients that we've had where we might take that view in hindsight that happened. But I think, what do I think about it? Not just about pushing for regulation, because regulation on its own will never be enough. Regulation is important, but it needs to be backed up by a whole cultural push behind it as well. The reason I don't go around murdering people is not because there's a law that says if I do it, it's against the law and I'll get put in prison, right? There's a whole other reason. So if I just don't want to, I know it's not the right thing to do, right? And it's the same reason why all sorts of things, a lot of the time don't go on in business practices, because it's seen to be abhorrent, and if you're caught doing it, everybody screams about it. But in terms of and biodiversity crimes of businesses, we don't scream anything like enough, because we don't have that culture to go with the regulation. But I do think businesses do have agency. I do think that the stories they tell, the messages they push for, what they lobby for, how they communicate with their customers, the whole way they communicate is really important in creating that big social wake-up everywhere. We're increasingly, in our work with businesses, that's increasingly important in what we're saying to them. First of all, we say, what is the fundamental nature of your business? Are you doing something that the world actually needs right now? Are you doing something that you can be confident fundamentally facilitates transition to a more sustainable future? Question number 2 is the way that you're communicating, pushing for that systemic change that we need as clearly as you can. And then thirdly, really, is things like, well, what are your own impacts, and are you doing the right things with those, which kind of important, but they are absolutely no way enough. And all that stuff about net zero for businesses and got tied up with offsetting and SBTI targets and all the rest of it. I think so much of that has turned out in the end to be collusion and the problem of it's perpetuated business as usual, and particularly the business of target setting, where you wait, it's lovely at the time, and then you wait a few years down the line and see no one's taking the action that goes with it.
And of course now we've got businesses that are relying on AI, which is going to be most businesses, and certainly digital businesses, back on their targets for exactly that reason. And also in terms of the offsets, of course, it's worth remembering that we had a lot of offsets in California until they burnt down. And that, I'm afraid, is going to happen more and more in the world that we're to.
We've been pretty doom and gloomy, right? Well, we've laid out a lot about the problem.
Can I make one other point about business specifically?
Yeah.
Which is that I like what you're saying there. The argument that I made in a piece in Reuters a few years ago is that the two great powers of business that haven't been sufficiently used for good in relation to what we're talking about are its lobbying power and its brand power, which I think is consistent with what you've said. But you can only make the most of brand power if you actually are doing the right thing such that you can be genuine and not be accused of greenwash. But you can only be genuine and not be accused of greenwash if you're actually able to be genuine and still stay in business. But then that comes back again to the lobbying power, right? Until there is a kind of higher level playing field for businesses, good intentions, they just cannot realise them when they run up against other competitors who don't have such good intentions and have worse morals.
No, I agree with all of that at the moment. I mean, some of the farmers we're working with think it's entirely legitimate for a farmer to say, look, I want to be farming like this, but the reality is I've got to feed my kids as well, and I'm just not made possible yet. And so I think it's a legitimate position to say, okay, well, I carry on, you don't let yourself off the hook, but you make the change I can given the situation I am, and I call as loudly as I can for the conditions to be such that I can in that direction. Yeah. And I think that's, I think the whole nature of it is to be a business. Like, business has to exist primarily for the benefit of people and planet. And there's no room anymore for businesses that aren't like that. Yeah, but we've talked a lot about the situation, and some of it, like in some ways, the AI thing, like is. But let's go on to theories of change a bit more. So I think it's this big systemic wake-up, right?
Yeah.
It comes from every direction at once. I'm totally with you about the media. There's a big chunk in my next book about the media as well, right? And it's politics and it's business. I'm totally with you about business and it's sort of public as well as all of that. And I think one bit of, if we look at tipping points, you talked about cascading tipping points in terms of the environment, but the same goes in this race between tipping points. Can we wake up? Can we suddenly tip to the point where, as a species, we get on the case? Little bits of progress that we make from all different directions also contribute to what can be a cascading tipping point. And I think it will happen. We get there, by which I'm getting to the point where we're on it, right, and we're dealing as best we can with the situation. I think it will come pretty suddenly, and it will come from everywhere at once, because it will all come together at once. And I agree with you about XR in 2019. That's when I felt most optimistic as well, because I felt like, some magic in that. They really got it about a message of positivity to all human beings, the message about truthfulness. It got near that action, picked up a sense of positivity. It wasn't just an angry protest, it was positive. And I
yeah.
think that was a point of difference that it had for me from Just Stop Oil and other things like that, which were
Yes.
also very well intentioned by the loveliest people you can think of, mainly, but somehow missed that critical ingredient. There's
Yes.
something about finding the magic. We're all looking for it in ways, and I think nobody's got the answer. It might be the climate majority project, might be it, and maybe I might push for sort of radical change on honesty, but maybe that's part of it. But what do we think? Well, shall we see what...
Well, shall I say one thing before we go to the
Yeah.
room about theory of change?
Yeah.
So obviously I've already said a fair bit about that implicitly, but just to make it kind of now, the way we see it in the Climate Majority Project, in order to get effective change, you have to have multiple things simultaneously. It's not just a question of like the most effective points of leverage and acting on them, etc. You've got to be thinking about this and communicating in this in a way that brings things together which are not, to put it mildly, always brought together. So I'm going to mention 4 such things. The first is truthfulness, which we think is a sine qua non. As I say, the idea of the Climate Majority Project is to bring that kind of authenticity and so forth to far larger number of people in all sorts of domains, such as people in the work they're doing, building resilience, and people in insurance and in business and in the arts and in universities. We're starting to work on that and so forth. Second, which goes exactly with the first, is people have to be helped to handle the difficult truth. There has to be resourcing to cope with just how dire the situation is. Otherwise people turn away in hopelessness or denial or so forth. And one way that we hope to manifest that is through the campaign that we've launched called Climate Courage, where the idea is wherever the difficult truth about climate and other existential threats gets told, people need to be resourced as a matter of course. So the most obvious place where this happens is, wait for it, educational settings, right? So this needs to happen in universities, this needs to happen in schools, this needs to be mainstreamed through the curriculum, that wherever climate and ecology and AI and so on come up, and they now should come up everywhere with the possible exception of pure maths, they come up, this resourcing ought to be available. Third strand of the theory of change, which again is intimately linked to the first two, is people have to have pathways to effective action along with other people that are available to them and meaningful to them. And I've already said a fair bit about what some of those pathways might be. And the fourth bit is we reckon that people also have to have a sense of there being lots of other people who think the kind of way that they do, which is why it's always helpful to do these straw polls. And I must say I was pretty encouraged by the result of the straw poll earlier, and I bet that quite a lot of you were as surprised I was to see just so many people put their hand to say, yeah, I think that's roughly right. I was, to be honest, slightly nervous when I gave my spiel. I thought, I bet there's going to be a lot of people in Lancaster University who are going to push back hard against this, but it looks like the only pushback I'm likely to get is from a few people who think that I'm still too pussyfooted and wishy-washy and optimistic.
Well, I wasn't nervous about that because I've been giving a lot of talks recently and I've got into a routine of... To be honest, I probably don't quite lay out the situation as starkly, but nearly as starkly, I'd say, as Rupert did. And I ask exactly those 3 questions, and I've now done it with thousands and thousands of people, really different audiences. Like, it could be 500 festival goers, but mostly business audiences. Not the kind of... yesterday, I did it with a whole load of people who do technology for water utilities. Kinds of businesses that you wouldn't think, oh, these are squeaky clean, just ordinary business, tobacco companies or oil companies, but it's always the same. It's always the same that the centre of gravity of the room is slightly... people think things are slightly worse than I portray them to be. So I just say, look, around you, because this is a point of difference. Yes. Not only do you get it, but now you can see that everyone around you gets it.
Yes.
So you can never be in a situation where you're in any room, in any meeting, having a conversation. If anybody talks in a way that is not commensurate with this context that we're in, then we all have a duty and a responsibility and a mission to go and put things back on track again. And we've got it now in this room as well. But the challenge is that we go away from here, and we're going to turn on Radio 4 in the morning, and you might hear the odd murmur about climate, something or other, and maybe something about biodiversity, but the whole flavour of everything you'll get all the messages you'll pick up will be that the appropriate response is to carry on as normal. And that is what we've got to break out of. That is what is. It takes such a lot of strength to hold it in your head and go, oh no, wait a minute, no, I get this stuff. And despite all the messages I'm going to get from my friends and my family and the person I talk to on the bus or whoever it is, like coming at us all the time, and we have to hang on to it and say, no, we're in a different context from that.
Yes. So it's those four things together: the truthfulness, the handling the truth, the pathways to action on the basis of it, the collective, the shared emerging collective awareness. And we suggest if you have all that and you put those forward in ways that are vivid and compelling and that are not polarising, this is crucial, and this is a point of difference from the radical flank. Eventually what we started in 2019 inevitably, because that's what the radical flank does, turned into something that was polarising. We have to depolarise on the basis of all of this. We have to assemble a very large plurality and then a majority of people who are actually active in this kind of direction. If we were to manage to do that, that is how we could definitely get through what is coming. One more remark about theory of change. In as much as it is highly likely that this heroic effort is not going to fully succeed, it is also vital always to have backstops. And this is the beauty of adaptation. It is simultaneously an enormous wake-up call and something that we just have to do anyway, and something that if everything else goes wrong, well, we still have to do it anyway. So, for example, people sometimes say to me, yes, but government is never going to take enough action on adaptation to get serious on this. I'm not sure that's true. I think it's possible they will. That's a kind of element of what starts to emerge in the story told, in the utopian story told in The Deluge. We've done this kind of thing before, we can do it again in terms of taking massive protective action. Think of COVID, think of a nice little instance like the very forward-thinking plan of the Thames Barrier. That was adaptation in action. Think of what happened during the Second World War. But if it is true that governments completely fail to rise to the occasion, and by the way, what we think obviously in the Climate Majority Project is that there's no way that politicians are ever going to lead us from the front through this, right? We have to push them into a position where they start to lead us. If it is true that governments fail to lead us enough, then the answer is just back to strategic and transformative adaptation. So it's a kind of permanent default or backstop, and there's something quite encouraging in that.
Okay, I think that's a really interesting question about whether adaptation innate mitigation or gets in the way of mitigation, and we could discuss that, but we could talk for hours, right?
We could, and we do.
There's plenty of. I would love to hear more from the room.